Kant is known for.
Yes.
This seminar will stick to time. 10 means 10.
Yes.
हाँ, कल शाम को आए। राजन कहाँ नहीं रहता है। Abstract हमने लिख दिया, फिर फुल पेपर भेजा मैंने वीक में, बोलता है इसको भी कंसिडर करिए। It's very hard. Last 1 week में 2 पेपर कॉपी।
I would like to request everyone to kindly keep your phones on silence mode, and we will be starting shortly.
Training selection.
A very good morning to everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you gathered here today at the international seminar on celebrating 300 years of Immanuel Kant, legacy, influence, and contemporary relevance, organized by the Center for Philosophy JNU in collaboration with ICPR. I would like to invite the chairperson, Center for Philosophy, Professor Natraju, to kindly take the stage and officially commence the proceedings with the welcome address.
Good morning. Namaste. And the chair of the session today, Professor Sachidananda Mishra, Member Secretary, Indian Council of Philosophical Research, and keynote speaker, Professor Peter McLaurin from Heidelberg University, known for his works on Kant, and speakers, delegates from across India and from elsewhere, and research students, graduate students, colleagues in the center. Welcome, welcome. Last year or so, when we completed the celebrating Vedanta Congress, there was this idea that, let's have a series of lectures on Kant's philosophy at the center. That was the basic idea. Across the globe, 300 years of Kant's philosophy was being celebrated, and we thought, why not have a series of talks on his philosophy and post-Kantians. Of course, later it turned into a seminar. It took a shape of the seminar because our good friend, sponsor, he said, I'll give you money for the seminar. I said, okay, thank you very much. Wherever money is available.
Do that.
It's been great support from him. Mishra ji is supporting us, not only this, and then we have a forthcoming faculty development program, 5-day program, in collaboration with ICPR. And then we have another collaboration with ICPR, having an international seminar on Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. We have a forthcoming, Dr. Bhaskarjit is doing one more social ontology workshop. There are a series of things lined up. But in most of the cases, the first name that comes to our mind when we need money is Professor Sachidananda ji. And I keep praising him in all kinds of seminars so that, that vibe is created. And, apart from, intellectuals, I do like intellectuals, but, sponsors are more important. Apart from it, he's an excellent Nayayika. And he is known for his works on Indian logic, epistemology, and is a very good Uttarvimamsaka, Vedantin for that matter. And recent work is on theories of error. Mandana Mishra's work is Vibhrama Viveka, 5 theories of error. In the Western counterpart world, we don't see great in-depth analysis on theory of error when it comes to knowledge. But Indians have dealt the last couple of thousands of years on theories of error. And his recent work is a Sanskrit commentary on theories of error for Mandana Mishra, Vibhrama Viveka Mandanam. And prior to his, after the Charvaka, we don't have a good manual for Charvaka philosophy. And he has done a Sanskrit manual, Navacharvaka Karikavadi. Correct, Professor?
Yes.
Yeah, Navacharvaka. He is good at his work. And welcome, sir. And Professor Peter McLaughlin from the Heidelberg. Now, with a short notice, actually, we must thank Krishnamani Pathak also. Pathak is here. Okay. So with his suggestion, I mean, we could connect to this professor who is known for his few decades of work on Kant and post-Kantian thinking. Expect nothing from me on Kant's philosophy. I'm a typical Vedantin. But since I'm told I have 10 to 12 minutes time to welcome, I've done with my welcoming thing, and now I have another 8 minutes. What I would do is, I was more fascinated for a couple of decades with Husserl's thinking. Vedantins are attracted to phenomenological method, phenomenological thinking. It's a natural attraction because their methodology aligns with phenomenological method. If not the whole project, if not the purpose of philosophizing, they don't match. They're just not on the same page, but they're just fascinated. So I was equally attracted last couple of decades to Husserl, Heidegger, and Sartre more than other thinkers in the European world. And here is, Kant is known for his critiques. Here is a critique from Husserl. I will start with that. On Kant's philosophy, on transcendental unity of apperception, nothing mine. It's a critique from Husserl, and then another 5 to 6 minutes and leave you there. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant famously declares that philosophy must no longer ask how our knowledge conforms to objects, but how objects must conform to the conditions of our knowing. The center of this transformation is Kant's doctrine of transcendental unity of apperception. Kant formulates it in one of the most decisive statements in modern philosophy. The I think, inverted commas, the I think must be able to accompany all my representations. For otherwise, something would be represented in me which could not be thought at all. The I think must be accompanying, therefore there is a unified sense of an object that we have. In my last lecture a week ago, when I was presenting the Vedantic thesis of consciousness, how consciousness makes something into an object and how objects are presented to consciousness. What is it to be an object, and when do you call something as an object? We have 3-4 definitions in our own area. Then somebody raised the question, are you comparing it with the theory of apperception in Kant's philosophy? Then my attention was drawn to this. The unity of consciousness is not a psychological fact. It is a supreme condition of the possibility of experience itself. As you are all Kant scholars, he's speaking about a structure of consciousness, which is an a priori condition for a cognition to be possible. Later comes the question of perception, understanding, imagination, and how the categories of understanding, etc. That's a later part. And it's an a priori condition for the very possibility of cognition to take place. The original and necessary consciousness of the identity of the self is at the same time a consciousness of an equally necessary unity of the synthesis of all appearances according to concepts. Critique of Pure Reason, B133. For Kant, now this is his position, and now I'll leave you with the Purupaksha. I mean, we call in Sanskrit famously Purupaksha, the opponent's view. When we Vedantins do, we start with a statement to be reflected upon, We call it Ananda Dhyana. A statement to be reflected upon. 2, Samshaya, doubt. Step number 3, Purupaksha, opponent's view. Step 4, and the thesis which contradicts the opponent, Uttarapaksha, and we end with what is called as Nirnaya. So every paragraph, every passage is looked at with these 5 steps, integrated into writing a paragraph. So now, for Kant, self-consciousness and objectivity arise together. In deep sleep experience analysis, if you see, in the absence of objects out there, the self-consciousness is also equally absent, and we say there is a bare awareness, minimal awareness. It's only in the waking state, once there are objects, you become self-consciousness. You become self-conscious also. So both self-consciousness and objects must be arising together. The subject is no longer one object among others. It becomes the transcendental condition, an a priori condition through which objects can appear as objects at all. I don't want to take you to a whole thesis on what is it to be an object. A, to be able to use it linguistically, something which is, approachable with a linguistic formulation. B, something which has a form, akara. C, something which is presented to cognition, etc., etc. The unity of apperception is that through which all the manifold given in an intuition is united in a concept of. I will leave you there. I have a couple of more pages, but we will leave it there. Now, for the last few minutes, here is the critique from Husserl, how many have done it, and many have answered it as well. Nothing new about it. So just to kickstart the things, Husserl raises a fundamental objection. He argues that Kant's account of consciousness remains primarily a theory of conditions, not a description of conscious life itself. That's the critique. He's not describing the conscious life, but he is giving us the conditions of what it is to be a consciousness, and then, of course, its relation with objects. In Cartesian meditation, this is Husserl's work, we must go back to the ego as it actually experiences and constitutes the world. Husserl's central dissatisfaction with Kant concerns the status of the transcendental ego. In Kant, the I think functions mainly as a formal principle that must be presupposed in every act of knowing. But it is never explored as an experienced dimension of consciousness. Husserl therefore insists in Ideas Pertinent, famously we call Ideas 1. The pure ego is not a piece of the world and not a part of any real object, but it is accessible in pure reflection. So for Husserl, the transcendental ego is not merely required by argument, it is disclosed within reflective experience itself. So post-Kantians did respond to this. They did have answers for all this. But just to, to start the proceedings, every cogito has its cogitatum, Ideas 1. This means that consciousness, only 2 minutes, sir. Don't be worried. I welcome will end the last paragraph. This means that consciousness is unified, not because a formal I think accompanies representations, but because every experience is already directed towards something. Obviously, you see the indication is towards the whole intentionality thesis. Unity belongs to the very structure of experience. So all originary presentive intuition is a legitimizing source of cognition, Ideas 1. This sentence has a last 2 lines. This sentence has a direct philosophical force against Kant's subordination of intuition to the activity of the understanding. Now, for Husserl, meaning and objectivity are not first constructed by categories. They are first given within experience itself. That's where he is making a departure. They are not constructed by the conditions of understanding, but they are first given within experience itself and only afterwards clarified by reflection. The deepest point of Husserl's critique, however, concerns the unity of consciousness over time. One last point. Kant presupposes the unity of apperception as an already functioning principle. He does not describe how such unity is lived, the lived experience. Um, Husserl, by contrast, shows that the unity of consciousness arises through the temporal flow of experience itself. That's a departure that Husserl. I will leave you there to think more and reflect and answer. Since you are all Kantians, reflect upon the critiques, and it's been handled earlier. I thought we will start with it, with this kind of thinking from Husserl. Again, welcome all of you. Welcome for the 3 day, reflections on philosophy, influence, legacy of Kant. And since to think is our primary purpose of philosophizing, we think, and here is the finest of the thinkers for all time. Apart from a couple of others, he is the finest, and celebrating his thinking. We thought we would expose our students and research scholars, and with select speakers from across the globe. And a lot of good work has been done by Dr. Smita Sirkar. And if you are speaking, it's because she has selected you. A lot of work in screening the abstracts and in making sure. And the one line was that students should benefit after listening to the speakers. And let's hope, you get sufficient 1 hour time to present your thesis, your paper. Let's hope you would have. And since many are standing already, it's a good sign. Keep standing. Thank you. Welcome all of you. And then we will start with the keynote speaker, and then chair will make his remarks. We avoided all that associated with inaugurals and valedictories. Let's hope this works well for that. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the welcome address. As sir has already introduced our chair, Professor Sachidanand Mishra, I will take a moment to introduce the speaker for this session. Professor Peter McLaughlin is a prominent American philosopher and professor emeritus at the Department of Philosophy, Heidelberg University, Germany. He specializes in the philosophy of science, particularly biology, and the history of early modern philosophy. He is recognized for his work on Kantian Aristotle's mechanical questions and teleological reflection. His prominent works include Kant's Critique of Teleological Judgment, 1989, Kant's Critique of Teleology in Biological Explanation, Antinomy and Teleology, 1990, and What Functions Explain, Functional Explanations and Self-Reproducing System, 2001. He has also held research positions at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin and the University of Constance. We welcome you, sir, and we are beginning with the first keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I should talk into the microphone. I assume you can all hear me? Yes. Yes? Okay. I'm very happy to be in Delhi once again. I've been here once. And I'm very happy to talk to you about Kant, a philosopher who has accompanied me all of my philosophical career. I'm a keynote speaker, but I will leave time for question and answer period. And encourage you, especially if you have precise differences of opinion, to ask me a question about them. I don't need agreement. Let me begin. You can learn a lot about Kant's system if you look at apparently marginal problems, consequences of the system, where he is forced to explain himself in details about things. So So I'm going to be talking today not about transcendental idealism or the relation of understanding and reason, these central problems. I'm going to be talking about mechanism and teleology, life in the organism. These are not the central questions of Kant's system, but they give you the opportunity to test your knowledge of that system. So you should be able to explain these things if you have understood the basic principles of Kant's philosophy. You should be able to follow them. So this will involve us also in a few questions that are, so to speak, local. Mechanism and teleology is a problem of the European modern age. It's not a problem of classical antiquity or maybe of other cultures. It's something that was a strong concern of European thinkers in the 17th and 18th century. So this is in a certain sense, local. And the conceptualizations of life in the organism are also European. So some of the, to understand Kant, some of the things you need to understand Kant are about Europe and about the 17th and 18th century. They're not just about fundamental categories of human existence or knowledge. I want you to imagine the architecture of Kant's philosophical system as consisting of three grand houses or mansions. One mansion for the true, one for the good, and the third one for the beautiful. Each of these mansions has its own critique. The first, the mansion of the true, has a critique of pure reason. The mansion of the good has a critique of practical reason. And the third mansion has a critique of aesthetic judgment. Each of these critiques has an analytic that expounds the correct philosophy and a dialectic that criticizes the false approaches to these philosophical problems. And each dialectic has its own antinomy of reason, specially constructed for use in criticizing the opposing view. This is sort of the way Kant packages philosophical problems. Now, I want to take a closer look at the third mansion, the critique of aesthetic judgment. This third critique also has a grand mansion. So you see, look at a stone brick or soda brick mansion. This mansion, the third one, has a rickety back porch, something like a wooden annex tacked onto the back of the building. It is called the critique of teleological judgment. This is the second part of the third critique. It too has an analytic and a dialectic. And in the dialectic, it has an antinomy. But this antinomy is not an antinomy of reason, like the others. It is just called the antinomy of judgment. How do I?
Can somebody help?
What is it?
Yeah, it's
Oh, there, I did it. This is just a sketch of where I'm going to be taking you. We will start with preliminaries on architecture, on the fundamental contradiction that Kant sees in the science of biology, and then I'm going to explicate terms, mechanism, and teleology, and introduce some terminological clarifications about organization or organism and life, till I come to the most important question at the end, which will be the main part of the lecture. What is mechanism for Kant? We will see in the analysis of biology that mechanism is the key concept, and mechanism is a key concept for modern philosophy. So as I was saying, the third critique has a wooden annex built on the back with an analytics and a dialectics. The dialectics has an antinomy, but it's not an antinomy of reason. It's not on. Okay. It is called it's called the antinomy of judgment. In Kant scholarship, everywhere you look, you will read Kant has an antinomy of teleological judgment. That's a term Kant scholars use. We talk about, in the critique of pure reason, we talk about the antinomy of division, the antinomy of freedom and determinism. We also talk about the antinomy of teleological judgment. The term does not occur in Kant's works, and that's important. It's an antinomy of judgment. It's not an antinomy of reason, but an antinomy of judgment. And it is said not to involve autonomous reason in contradictions, but merely involves judgment in some secondary difficulties. So reason is the king. Judgment is a more minor faculty of the intellect. So in this dialectics, in this antinomy, we have judgment getting into trouble with itself. And it is restricted to those occasions when judgment is allowed to make its own decisions. But judgment is normally a faculty of subsumption. So you have a universal and you have a particular, and you subsume the particular under the general. And the faculty in Kant's system that does that is judgment. So it's a sort of subaltern faculty of the mind. But on one occasion, one particular occasion, judgment is sort of autonomous. If you have a particular which you want to subsume under the universal and don't know what the universal is, you have to find it. And judgment is allowed to give itself rules for finding the universal that it needs to subsume a particular under. So in this particular case, judgment is fairly autonomous. And Kant introduces a technical term, pay autonomy, to denote the special autonomy of judgment in this particular instance. Normally, judgment has to do what it's told, but in this case, it can give itself a rule for seeking the universal. In this talk, I shall be examining some of the plumbing in this wooden annex, which nonetheless will tell us something about the system as a whole. And this particular problem of subsumption is what Kant uses to solve problems with the sciences of life. Okay. Okay, the quote at the bottom of this slide is just from the critique of aesthetic judgment, where Kant introduces a system of antinomies and tells you why each faculty of the mind has an antinomy and what kind of antinomy, and that there have to be three of them and only three, and there can't be any more. And then 50 pages later, he introduces the antinomy of judgment. But if you look closely at the text, he's talking about a systematic of antinomies of reason, not judgment. So Kant is telling us in the critique of teleological judgment, I'm doing subaltern stuff, which is not integral to the architectonics of the system. And that's important, and generally unrecognized, that we're dealing with sort of an annex to the system, but that's relevant to deciding what to do about the problems in this annex. Okay. In any naturalistic investigation of human behavior, there are two levels at which things become complicated, and questions about emergence or reduction must be asked. That is, there are 2 points in a reductionistic explanation of natural events where there are threshold phenomena that have to be dealt with in a different way. Normally, the reducing a system to the properties and interactions of the parts, but sometimes you get to a point where it's hard to do. Normally, this threshold phenomenon appears when we move from physics to biology and from biology to psychology. When we move from the physical to the organic and the organic to the mental, there is some difficulty, even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool reductionist. You see, I've got to explain something here at these two different levels, which we normally call life and mind. Kant does not call them life and mind. There's a third level that, of course, can be introduced if we move to metaphysical and moral questions and ask about epistemic or moral norms, self-consciousness, and various other things that contemporary analytical philosophy places in Frege's third realm. But in this talk, I will ignore this higher level of stuff. I'm down on the physical level, the transfer from physics to biology or biology to psychology. So I'm going to ignore these third realm issues and focus on the lower level emergent phenomena. In particular, the transition from the physical to the organic. Immanuel Kant viewed both of these lower level transitions as crucial for science. However, although he singles them out as fundamental scientific and philosophical issues, he does not try to solve them by giving a scientific explanation of the transition, but rather offers us a philosophical workaround to avoid explaining. At the psychological level, the interaction of mind and body, or what Kant and other 18th century philosophers called the commercium, the community, or he asserts that the problem is incomprehensible. So we cannot comprehend the transition from body to mind. On the other hand, the transition from the purely physical system to organic system, Kant calls inscrutable. We actually have different terms. There's the incomprehensible, unbegreiflich in German, and the inscrutable, unerforschlich. And to a certain extent, he's consistent using these terms. I mean, with Kant, you always have exceptions, but it is a terminological distinction. So one problem is said to be incomprehensible. The other is to be inscrutable in the sense of you cannot investigate it consistently. The incomprehensible question of mind-body interaction, especially mental causation, is dealt with, or rather the workaround is dealt with, in the Critique of Pure Reason. And the inscrutable question of organic form is dealt with in the Critique of Teleological Judgment. So in the Critique of Teleological Judgment, in the second part of the Critique of Judgment, we're dealing with the transition from the physical to the organic. In the resolution to the so-called third antinomy in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant sketches a rather deterministic view of the world, in which an observer with a complete knowledge of the laws of nature and a complete knowledge of the present state of the world could predict everything that happens at a later time. The only difference here to the later Laplacian version of this thought experiment is that Kant's observer must also know the current mental states of all the human agents involved, what Kant calls the empirical character of every individual. So Kant does not reduce psychology to physics, but he's a determinist in the classical sense, in the phenomenal realm, the realm of appearances. But Kant elsewhere also makes it clear that whatever happens or does not happen in mental causation, the result must be compatible with the basic laws of the conservation of force in the universe. Kant does not tell us how the immaterial mind acts on the material body, but he assures us that this action is compatible with physical conservation laws, and thus we don't need to worry about it. So the conservation, we would call it conservation of energy. They weren't that far in the 18th century. The conservation of force is necessary for physics, for deterministic explanation of the universe. And mental causation is not going to mess around with that. He thinks there is something like mental causation, but it is somehow compatible with the conservation of physical energy, and the whole thing is incomprehensible. But that's not the problem for philosophy. We have just fixed it, so to speak. In the so-called enemy of judgment, in the third critique, Kant characterizes the new science of biology by a fundamental contradiction between a holistic ideal description and a reductionistic ideal of explanation. That's the antinomy of judgment. So you have a holistic ideal of phenomenal description of organic phenomena and an exclusively reductionistic ideal of explanation. So the job of biology is to conceptualize the organism as irreducible and then reduce it. And you are supposed to live with this contradiction. In the explanation of an organism, the biologist should insist on rich and holistic descriptions of the phenomena, but should accept only reductionistic explanations of the system so described. These two prescriptions are called regulative principles, and the biologist is expected to live with the pragmatic contradiction in her daily work. The principle of reduction is formulated as explanation in terms of merely mechanical laws. The principle of holistic description is formulated as a requirement to use an entirely different law of causality, namely that of final cause. So if you take a look at the slide, we have the formulation of the antinomy of judgment. Let me read it here. Two maxims are in contradiction. The first maxim of the power of judgment is the presupposition: all production of material things in their forms must be judged as possible in accordance with merely mechanical laws. The second maxim is a counter proposition: some products of material nature cannot be judged as possible in accordance with merely mechanical laws. Their judgment requires an entirely different law of causality, namely that of final causes. So, what Kant is telling us is you should always reduce the phenomena to mechanical law. And he also says sometimes you can't. And if you can't, I have a workaround. We call that final causes. And you see also that the final causes are in parentheses. So the antinomy is between the necessity of mechanical explanation and the impossibility of mechanical explanation. And should those two contradictory requests occur at the same time, then we have a workaround in the parentheses. So the appeal to final causes is used when you have this situation where you cannot reduce the phenomenon. Workaround, look at it as if it was subjected to final causation. Okay, in the next part of this talk, I will try to clarify the relation between mechanical laws and final causes that Kant sees as the basis of the science of biology. This will necessitate an explanation of the meaning of mechanism in Kant's philosophy. What are these mechanical laws? What is mechanism? The concept of mechanism in Kant's philosophy turns out to be extremely context dependent. So what he means by mechanical this or mechanical that depends on where we are in our discussions. It can have many different meanings. I'm going to try and explain to you what the unity of these disparate meanings is, but it has various meanings in various contexts. Thus, in the context of freedom and determinism, where the counterpart is noumenal agency, the mechanism of nature is the entire phenomenal world. In a purely phenomenal context, where we're just doing with appearance, where the counterpart is the merely temporal, the mental or the psychological, mechanism means the physical. Just causation under conditions of spatiality, the opposite. And here it is the opposite of life. Mechanism is the opposite of life. In a purely physical or spatial context, where the counterpart is organization, mechanism is a kind of part-whole determinism. We call it merism. It becomes clear that the question of life for Kant lies in the realm of the mental, the non-spatial, and then is completely separate from the question of organism, which is confined to the spatial. That is, terminological problem when you're reading Kant, the upper level emergent phenomenon, which we normally call mind, is called by Kant, sometimes mind, is called life. Life is a psychological category. Life is mental. Life has to do with spatiality, not with spatiality, with representation and desire. I'll say more about that later. As a consequence, the transition from the physical to the organic is internal to physical science, and thus biology for Kant is a special part of physics. Any teleology which we may be compelled to introduce there is not real, but as if. Kant is famous for saying as if in this context. Life, on the other hand, is confined to the realm of psychology, causation, that in some incomprehensible manner is compatible with physical conservation. So when Kant talks about teleology, it's the real thing. It's not something we're ashamed of and don't want to talk about. It is mental causation. A representation of the phenomenon is causally responsible for the production of the phenomenon. This is a real causation, but it's psychology, it's the mind. It's not involved in organisms, unless they also have minds, of course. So we will we will see that um, uh, that plants for Kant are not alive, animals are alive, but both plants and animals are organisms. Um, but I'll come to that. So I want to talk about mechanism and teleology from a different perspective today. Um, to focus on the concept of life. Normally, we're talking about organisms, and you will see Kant's example when he explains what an organism is always a plant. It's a tree, where he explains the teleology of the organism. It's not an animal. The term life, in fact, in the critique of teleological judgment, hardly occurs, and only in a special context where it's the main theme. So Kant talks about organisms, but not about life in the critique of teleological judgment. And there's a later development in Kant's philosophy where Kant says in the Critique of Pure Reason and famously in a marginal note, the Critique of Pure Reason, that we can't say anything about the interaction of mind and body. It's incomprehensible. There's nothing to be said. But Kant lectured on rational psychology every year for 30 years. And lecture was, you read a textbook and comment on it. And the textbook is telling the students all about the interaction of mind and body. So Kant was lecturing on the interaction of mind and body all his life and saying there's nothing to be said about it. And so he can't help it but occasionally try and fix the problem and tell you something about the interaction of mind and body. So there are in later works remarks by Kant, also in his lectures, but in especially in a work on by a neuroscientist called Summering. He wrote an afterword to the book and talks a little bit about it. Where then of course you have to say he's not allowed to do that. He's being inconsistent, but he does it anyway. So there's nothing to be said about this interaction. We're going to stick, however, now to organization and its opposite. So Kant lectured on metaphysics and rational psychology every year throughout his career, and mind-body interaction is a standard problem. Thus, when his publisher asked him to write a small thing on it, on the mind-body problem, he did. Now, I'll try to explain to you now briefly what mechanism is in early modern science in Europe. Can you read the mechanism in the 18th century is the reduction of a phenomenon to the system, the phenomena of a system. I'm using the word phenomena. It's simply the appearances of the system. So you take a clock, the hands are moving, you explain how the hands are moving by taking the clock apart and explaining how the parts produce the phenomenon. So mechanism is a reduction of the system to the properties and interactions of the parts. The properties and interactions of these parts may be the subject matter of physics or not. So if I reduce the system to the properties of the parts, and I reduce the parts to the properties of their parts, etc. And at some point I stop and say these are the basic physical entities, And their properties are, in the mechanical philosophy of the 17th century, are extension, impenetrability, mobility, and things like that, which are studied by the science of mechanics. So a mechanical explanation is a reduction of a phenomenon to properties of the parts, and the properties of the parts are studied by the science of mechanics. This second proposition is not necessary. It could be that the basic parts have properties which do not belong to the science of mechanics. They might be chemical or whatever. And in the 17th century, they wanted them to be the properties of mechanics, but other properties were possible. And in the course of the 18th century, it became possible to make these properties latent. So every particle of matter has chemical affinities, but they only become relevant in a certain constellation of particles. Or every particle of matter has a life force, which is latent and only becomes relevant in a certain constellation of factors. So it's always there, but it only appears in certain systems. So you can be a vitalist and say all matter is alive, but it doesn't show it until you get to the right constellation. So in the 18th century, you can be a vitalist and a mechanist at the same time, because you're reducing the phenomena of the system to the properties and interactions of the parts. So just because somebody is a mechanist doesn't mean they don't have crazy ideas. Yeah. So there's all kinds of possibilities still within the core mechanism. So the ultimate properties of the parts need not be mechanical. They are for most people, but you can still be an ontological mechanism, so to speak, without being a physical mechanism. That's a quotation from Newton where he explains the analytical method, which is basically what a reduction is. You dissect the system and analyze the parts. And mechanism is the determinism of the whole by the properties and interactions of the parts. So the opposite of this kind of mechanism is actually sort of holism, where you would say the properties of the parts are determined by the whole. That is something that was very common in European philosophy in the Middle Ages, but it ceases to exist with the 17th century. And Kant thinks it's simply unintelligible. Yeah. It's my vision is not good enough for me to read my own. Okay. Fine. This is a quote from Thomas Hobbes, where he tells you from Robert Boyle, who tells you what the mechanical properties of matter are and how you find it out. If you look at this, you will see this is an entirely individualistic and possibly bourgeois view of the world. How do I determine what the properties of matter are? I imagine that there's nothing in the world, and I place one particle in it alone, sort of a state of nature. And I ask what this body has to have for properties for me to be willing to call it a body. And what does Boyle tell us? Matter, motion, arrest, bulk, shape. Those are the things that, so it's an entirely individualistic, abstract. A single body in empty space would have these properties. And those are the properties I attribute to fundamental particles. Here you see the social scientific version of the same thing. with Thomas Hobbes, justice and injustice are none of the faculties neither of body or mind. If they were, they might be in a man that were alone in the world, as well as his senses and passions. So if we are alone, the same nature, we have senses and passions, but no justice. Um, these qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. So, mechanical explanation is the explanation of a system by the system-independent properties of the parts. Okay, the ultimate properties were considered to be mechanical in the 17th century. In the 18th century, it fell apart and they introduced all other kinds of things. For instance, this lonesome particle in empty space has no gravity. Because to have gravity, you need two particles. So gravity is not an essential property of bodies. It caused Newton great difficulty. But in the course of the 18th century, you introduce gravity, magnetism, chemical affinities, and vital forces. They have to be latent in the sense of an individual particle in empty space wouldn't have them or wouldn't display them, but they come out in society, so to speak. Okay, that's mechanism. Teleology was banished from philosophy by philosophers in the 17th century. Most quoted are Bacon, Descartes, and Hobbes. They said teleology, the final causes, have nothing to do with reality. Final causes. Do I have a slide on final causes? Final causes come from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle divided causal relations up into four aspects, where typically when you build a house, you need materials, you need a plan of what the house is going to look like, you need force or a builder to do it for you, and you need a purpose that the house is to fulfill. And all these four things must be part of your explanation of the house. These were codified in the Latin tradition in the Middle Ages as causa finalis, final cause, causa formalis, formal cause, causa materialis, the material cause, and causa efficiens as the efficient cause. In this tradition, however, the final cause was always mental. In Aristotle, it's different, at least as we read him since the 19th century. But Aristotle had final causes, but they were submental. They were somehow in nature. But in the medieval tradition and the early modern period, final causes are always mental representations in the mind of some agent. These are two publications, one by Robert Boyle, one by Christian Wolff, a disquisition on the final causes of natural things. Final causes for Boyle are always ideas in the mind of God. And with Christian Wolff, it's called Vernünftige Gedanken von den Absichten der natürlichen Dingen, also rational thoughts on the intentions of natural things. So when these people are talking about final causes, they're talking about intentions in the mind of God, or intentions in the mind of some artisan. So that final causes are mental efficient causes. Yeah? They're not something in the future. They are before the thing is made in the mind of some agent. So their final causes are actually efficient causes, but they're mental. And this was propagated all over physics as part of Newtonian philosophy. So teleology in this period means the doctrine of final causes, final causes are mental representations in the mind of someone. And so if you talk about final causes, you're talking about mental agents. Because with Aristotle, you're not necessarily. But as he was read in this period, final causes are mental causes that involve a representation of the goal state. Okay, now back to Kant. Some terminological clarifications. The term organism, we talk about organism all the time. The term organism is not a count noun in the 18th century. So you don't call animals and plants organisms. Organism is the principle of their organization. So they aren't things. Mechanism also is not a thing in this period. It's the principle of organization. So Kant, when he talks, when I say Kant's theory of the organism, I mean what he says about organized beings or organic bodies. And there's a number of other terms. The term reproduction in this period means more something like what we would say regeneration or metabolism. If the organism reproduces itself in its lifetime. And these properties are always illustrated on the basis of a tree or plant. And that's fully compatible with Aristotle's notion of the vegetable soul, and as interpreted by Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas asks whether the vegetative soul is fittingly described as something that does nutrition, growth, and generation. Those are the three characteristics of organisms that Kant was emphasizing. So when we're talking about organisms and their nourishment, reproduction, when we're talking about nourishment, growth, and generation of organisms, we're within the area of the vegetable soul in the tradition. Okay, what is life for Kant? And I'll give you two examples of how Kant defines life, and he's very consistent in this. Life is the faculty of a being to act in accordance with laws of the faculty of desire. The faculty of desire is a being's faculty to be the means of its representation, the cause of the reality, by the means of its representations, the cause of the reality of the object of these representations. So life is a function of the faculty of desire. Faculty of desire, in this sense, is a psychological faculty. It's not the moral faculty of stuff. And it involves a representation. Or from the metaphysical foundation of natural science, life is the faculty of a substance to determine itself to act from an internal principle. It goes on to desiring. So life always involves representation and desire for Kant. Organization does not involve that at all. So we have two different concepts. We have organization and we have life. One is sort of the biological principle. The other is a psychological principle. So if you read the term life anywhere in Kant, look at, he's talking about mind. There's a representation or a desire someplace involved. There is no submental life for Kant. So it's a function of representation and desire. A living being has a capacity to represent and to desire. This has a strange consequence, of course, that for Kant, plants are not alive. It's not world-shattering. It's a peculiarity of Kant that he always means animals when he speaks of life. So, uh, so this is a wording. A very important Kant scholar named McCreel tried to give an explanation about how the critique of judgment is a unified work. This is a sort of a scandal in Kant scholarship. Nobody can explain why the critique of judgment has two parts. What the teleology has to do with the aesthetics. What the theory of the organism has to do with the theory of beauty. And many people have tried. One attempt by Mr. McCreel was to say, well, let me see if I can use the concept of life to unify this critique. And he found out that the concept of life can be used very productively in interpreting the aesthetics, and was surprised to see that it's used more often in the aesthetics than in the other. But it's not used in the teleology in any important sense at all. The teleology is not about life. The aesthetics can be interpreted in terms of life. Okay. My time is running out. I want to tell you what mechanism is for Kant. Mechanism or mechanistic is just the opposite of its counterpart in the context. Memory can be ingenious or mechanical. Education can be judicious or mechanical. Art can be beautiful or fine art or mechanical art. So Kant uses mechanism to mean the less valued of two alternatives. But there are architectonically more interesting uses of the term mechanism. So let me try and explain to you how it is. Our ontology can be divided up into two parts, into noumena and phenomena. This is Kant. Things in themselves and appearances. When the things in themselves are viewed from the point of view of freedom, the counterpart, the opposite, is the mechanism of nature. And that's what Kant says in the introduction to the B version of the Critique of Pure Reason. The mechanism of nature is all of the phenomenal world. But the phenomenal world can be divided up into two parts. The mental and the material, the psychological and physical. He uses Leibniz's terms automaton spirituale and automaton materiale. So we have the teleological connections and physical connections. And if I look at the mental, the psychological as life, include as life, then the opposite of life is mechanism. So in the context of the purely phenomenal, if I want the opposite of life, it's mechanism. So mechanism is half of the phenomenal world. In one sense, it's all of the phenomenal world. Now it's half of the phenomenal world. But the physical world can also be divided up into two parts. First of all, the primary opposition between mechanism and teleology is that between physical causation and mental causation. Mental causation is causation mediated by a representation. Final cause is teleology. That's the main interpretation of teleology in the 18th century and in Kant. But in the Critique of Teleological Judgment, it's not what he means by teleology. So the physical, that is the non-living world, can be divided up into two parts. The reductionist part and the holistic part. Whereby when he talks about holism, Kant always means apparent holism. Maybe isn't real, but it looks real. So we can divide the physical realm up into two parts, the reductionist, explainable part, and the holistic or apparently holistic part, which I call organism. So I can use mechanism as the opposite of organism in explaining the world. So organization is a physical state or principle. We're in physics here with organization. So that the teleology of the organism is not real, but merely as if. I can't conceptualize a system as holistic, or if I want to explain how the whole can have a causal influence on the parts, I can only conceptualize that as the idea of the whole has a causal influence on the parts, and some agent is involved. So there can't be, according to Kant and his colleagues, there can't be holistic causal relations, but apparent holistic causal relations must be causation of an agent which has a conceptualization of the whole. So, now, to make things more complicated, of course, this third realm, third kind of mechanism, so purely half of the physical world, can also be divided up into chemistry and mechanics. But that's a technical physical question, which he does in the metaphysical foundations of modern science. But that's not involved here at all. So we're back to a partial area of physics, which is called mechanism. And if we go back now to the mechanical laws, that is, Kant is talking about, in theory of the organism, if you can't explain an organism mechanistically, that is, reductionistically in this sense, then you have to appeal to final causes in order to get holistic relations. But only in that situation, and only if you can't do it. But it's still all. The important thing is when we're dealing with plants, with organization in this sense, we're in physics. This is pure physics. And there's a number of other places in Kant where he makes it clear that he considers plants not to be alive and not to be part of anything more than the physical. So organization is a inner physical problem, which we have with plants and animals, but also with plants. And it forces us to introduce as if teleological relations. And Kant then calls, as he called organization, as he called the commercium, mind-body interaction, incomprehensible. He calls organization inscrutable. Unerforschbar would mean not to be investigated. So there are terminological differences, and when Kant talks about mechanism in the context of the organism, we're dealing with pure physics. So I will leave it at that, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll start with you. Yeah.
I think I can speak from the mic here. Thanks, Professor McLaughlin. It's very interesting, and especially from the philosophy of science. I have just two remarks or questions. The first one is this, like the fourfold causation of Aristotle, now in the early modernity or early modern age is reducing into one causa efficientia, like causa materialis. Anything, all this can be the decision of, like the example given by Aristotle, like a sculptor making a sculpture, and he can decide on the material. He can, and obviously the causa formalis is in his mind, and same with causa finalis. Yeah, but I think in Aristotle, it was completely from outside the mind. It's the thing that is being made by which material and for which for what and in which form and all. So I would say then what is causa efficiency? It's also a participatory causation where the form participates and the telos participates. So this is something which I think I see a major shift what happens in the early modernity from that object to the subject. The second point is you mentioned the gravity, like presuppose two bodies, but I think in the pre-Newtonian particular gravities of Kepler, Roberval, and particularly Robert Hooke, and there's only one body, and of course there are various parts that the gravity holds together, but still there's one body that is held together.
Okay, Aristotle's final clauses is a particular problem because we say Aristotle said this. What we attribute to Aristotle since Hegel is completely different than the Aristotle between Thomas Aquinas and Kant. So for this period, Aristotle is Catholic. He's a Christian with a God who does things. When Kant talks about teleology and final causation, he's talking. He thinks he's talking about Aristotle. He's not. Or I'm from Heidelberg. We have Gadamer, and if you do, there is no Aristotle. There's just our Aristotle, and our Aristotle since the 19th century is someone has a submental teleology and very complicated. The Aristotle before that was had the artisan God. You think Aristotle, I agree with you, but Kant is thinking of a completely different thing than Aristotle. And of course, in the 17th century, with gravity, it is a serious problem. What that is, and you have a time where people reject action at a distance, where they don't have fields. Okay, so that gravity is not only something that demands two bodies; it's an external relation. It's not intrinsic, but it also demands action at a distance, which is unintelligible. So it's rejected for two reasons. But after Newton, you can't reject it. So you have to find a workaround to integrate it into your system.
Sir, may I ask one
Yes,
doubt?
please.
You mentioned Aristotle in Catholic, or I misheard it.
That was facetious. Aristotle was Christianized by Thomas Aquinas, and
Yeah,
everybody
because
created that.
Aristotle was much before, it came before, like Christianity was after Aristotle. So, however, when we read Western philosophy, somehow we need to have a little background of Christian philosophy also. So, how do we really make a clear distinction between the Greek philosophy and the philosophy that is being Christianized in the later part?
Okay, I would say with any philosopher not from our period, you have to ask, what are we doing with this person? What are we bringing to the reading of this text that is different from other people? And I mentioned Gadamer, whom I don't normally cite, but in this particular regard, I think he was right. That we bring a lot of information or bring ourselves to the text, and the meaning that we construct in reading this text is not necessarily that something that someone else in a different period would construct from this text. And although I am a bit more realistic than Gadamer, that you can have better or worse interpretations, or that you can say Aristotle can't have meant something like that. he didn't know about evolution, or he didn't know about particle physics or something. That is legitimate. But I think you should always reflect on what we are doing when we're reading this text. And you see in the Middle Ages, Thomas was bringing all kinds of Christianity to Aristotle. Not necessarily Christianity, simply presuppositions of Christianity, like you could have a body without a soul, that you could separate the body and the soul. Aristotle was saying, "You're crazy. Where have you seen a body with a soul without a body? It's silly." That's sort of reifying your abstraction. But for Aquinas, that was normal. That is probably the cardinal sin. It's not Christianity. Christianity does that all the time. But I think it's important when reading texts from other cultures or other periods to reflect on what you are bringing in knowledge to this text that perhaps the author didn't have. So that you're not projecting too much on him. And I would try, as opposed to Gadamer, to say there is an Aristotle, but we can only get to that by first doing our Aristotle and then saying, okay, how much of what I brought to Aristotle can I abstract from, at least get an idea of what a normal. I mean, Gadamer would say you can abstract from what you bring. It's silly to say an unread Aristotle meant this. But I would try to do some kind of workaround where I could say, I could argue that Aristotle meant that rather than this, and that our interpretation after Hegel is better than Kant's interpretation of Aristotle. But that's and it's not just that we are different. Then there's some prog. I don't know. Okay.
One last question.
Yeah, sir,
Only one question now, because this is Kant seminar, not Vedanta. We stick to time. Yeah, one last.
so basically, I'm little curious about how you reduce the definition of life only to the critique of practical reason, the synonymity of life with desire. Like if we try to look at the notion of life in critique of pure reason, it becomes knowing. In practical region, you just define it as desire, and in the judgment, it becomes feeling. So I'm just trying to know how can we limit the idea of life to just one particular notion. And it is particularly interesting to locate this question with Kantian definition of philosophy, which he defines like this: that uh, the Kant defines philosophy as the science of the relation of all knowledge to the essential end of human region. Can we say that desire is only the single end of human region, or is there anything else? So I guess knowing and feeling is also another aspect of life which we cannot escape at first hand.
Okay. In different contexts, life will have different emphases. My only point was that it always involves representation and desire. That if you are not able to represent, are not able to desire, you're not alive in Kant's sense. So and that in various contexts he takes in different directions. That's not a problem. But your second question was.
With Kantian definition of philosophy, simply limiting life to the notion of desire becomes quite problematic. And this desire thing, or the representation thing, becomes quite reductive. And I guess he was quite opposed to this teleology or consequentialism or whatever you want to say.
Okay, I mean, listen. Life exists in various forms, and a rat is alive. It has representation and desire according to Kant. But that's just one animal among many. We are also, like rats, have representation and desire, but we also have the other side, the moral side. And that is, for Kant, the important side.
Yeah, the others would obviously, professor is available next 3 days. you can talk to the chairperson's remarks.
Thank you, Professor.
Dear friends,